Is it worth engaging in free speech to understand hateful white supremacists? Has the U.S. Constitution failed? Is the government collusion real? Collusion with Pfizer and Moderna, that is. We'll tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hello, friends. Welcome to Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather posts that we find on our social media feeds, some of them good, some of them not so good. And we like to break down and see the ones that aren't so good and talk about why they aren't so good, what the assumptions they're making that may be wrong, and then highlight some good takes that illuminate some things that we like, maybe offer a new perspective than the traditional narrative on issues. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to like and comment, share, all that good stuff. Really helps us out. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and start rating some of these takes. So the first one is a tweet that reads, Elon Musk claims his Twitter allows us to understand the other side better. What he doesn't get is that I don't want to understand a bunch of racists who believe conspiracy theories, spew hate, and worship a failed president who sold out our country. Okay, well, that's one perspective to take. Britt, what are your thoughts on this take? Are you giving that a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
I definitely think it's a thumbs down. I think it's a bad take. This is kind of a classic pillar, I guess, of debate, is that in order for you to truly be able to debate someone, you have to understand why they believe what they believe. And so it's really just a sign of laziness when you say, oh, well, I don't need to understand your side because you're just racist and a conspiracy theorist and you worship this failed president. It just means that you haven't put any effort into understanding their position. Maybe those things are true, but you haven't proven it to anyone. And so the fact that this person doesn't want to even understand that kind of gives away that they might have some ulterior motive than actual truth and principle and all this stuff. As much as I really dislike the movie, did you ever watch Captain Marvel? Did you watch it? Okay. I didn't really like Captain Marvel, but this made me think of how in that spoiler alert, I can save it for all of you guys that haven't seen it yet. Don't go see it because it's a terrible movie. But the people that are the bad guys in that, the shape-shifting folks, turn out that they're like, they're actually like, when you actually look at all the truth and all the actual history and all the things that are going on, they're actually the people that are being persecuted. They're not the actual villains in it. And so once the main protagonist takes a moment to actually understand what's going on, their perspective shifts and they realize something, a little bit different. And I think this person would benefit from that. And that's why it's so important for freedom of speech to exist, because bad ideas can be debunked. Good ideas can be lifted up and strengthened and pitted against those bad ideas and contrasted. Without free speech, that doesn't exist. And so Musk's claim, I don't know if that's actually going to happen, yet with Twitter. I think on our last show, we showed he doesn't necessarily believe that freedom of speech is the same as freedom of reach. I think they're kind of the same in a lot of ways. But at least in principle, he understands why it's important. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it's a bad thing that this person doesn't want to understand the other side.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before on some takes that we've had in the past that are along these lines, where generally speaking, conservative people are very able to articulate the opposite perspective. They can articulate why the leftist believes what they do and argue their position decently well. And left-leaning people are terrible at doing that for conservatives. And it's one of those things where I think people on the left view that as like a checkmate, like, oh, wow, that's because, left-leaning arguments have the academic rigor behind them. Even a conservative can understand it because it's so morally sound. And they completely miss how they're indicting themselves and their own inability to make, because it's like, it doesn't, even if you think an argument is weak, if you're not even making that argument, it shows that you don't understand it. It doesn't show that the argument's weak if you can't make it. It's like, if we're talking about, let's say, white supremacists, if my critique, which I'm not a white supremacist, I think white supremacists are racist. I think they're stupid, and I think their arguments are very bad. But if my claim against them is, white supremacists only believe that because they hate everyone else, it's like, well, actually, that might be a very small subset, but a lot of the arguments they make actually has to do with what they would view as genetics, IQ, cultural assimilation, the way that different cultures have been forced to not adapt to what their history is, whether that, and they would specifically view that as, with immigrants coming into the US and forcing traditional American lifestyles out, and they want to collect and rebuild that. That's their basic argument. And I think you can take that down a number of ways.
Yep.
But if you were just to boil it down, as this person does, is all they want to do is spew hate and believe conspiracy theories. Again, that doesn't show that the white supremacist argument is weak. That shows that your ability to articulate it is weak. And so, yeah, this person reminds me of that earlier take we had where the person was, the journalist was like, maybe we need to examine ourselves and see why people are listening to Rogan and not the media.
Yep.
And that person was like, we don't need to understand why people want to listen to a racist and not us. It's that exact same mentality where these people think that by reducing the opposing arguments down to what they aren't, watering them down and just maligning them and straw manning them, they think that proves that the other argument's weak, when in fact it just shows that the person saying those things is in fact intellectually weak.
Yeah, and it reminds me of an argument that was made against Jordan Peterson many times, and that people will say things like, well, Jordan Peterson is bad because the majority of his audience are angry white young men or whatever. Like that's usually what they'll say, which in of itself is a pretty awful argument. But even if you take that at face value, it's not true, right? I mean, yes, there are young men that are fans of Jordan Peterson, but they're not just young. They span the entire age group. I think his key demographic is like 24 to 40 or something like that. So, I mean, there's an age group there, and that's not necessarily young, maybe more middle-aged, depending on how you classify middle age. Let's throw back to one of our the very first episode of Good Take, Bad Take. But let's even grant the premise that, yes, his entire audience is young, angry white men. How does that, what shouldn't someone be speaking to those people? What are you going to do with those people if that's the case? Should they just be left alone to fester? So at some point, even if you make that argument, you still have to get to, okay, well, yes, we want someone to be talking to these people. We don't want to exclude them from society because they're never going to get better if they are young, angry white men that are doing bad things. So therefore, someone should be talking to them. If someone is talking to them, what then should that person be saying? And so you inevitably arrive at the point where you have to now engage with his arguments, but no one ever wants to do that, right? No one ever wants to talk about what Jordan Peterson is actually saying. Clean up your room. Don't be angry. Don't be so weak that you eventually become angry and bitter, because anger and bitterness eventually leads to bad, awful suffering and bad things. No one wants to engage in that because it's actually a really, really wholesome message that is really good. And it's because like I was saying at the very beginning, they have ulterior motives, right? Jordan Peterson is a threat to their ulterior motives. So we're going to use some broad brush to paint his audience and to dismiss him that people can really grab onto. And so this person is making that error as well.
Yeah. The other thing I will say about this is this is the person who rushes to jump on the, like, Joe Rogan is a racist and he should be deplatformed. And I think the number one thing to say is, okay, so if you silence speech like that, you aren't going to drive the people listening. The people who listen to them aren't just going away. They're not just, oh, I'm de-radicalized because I can't listen to this person. But the second thing, and the reason I specifically say Joe Rogan, is because they're so quick to jump on people without actually listening to them.
Yeah.
I recently saw like a TikTok of a segment of Joe Rogan's podcast where he was talking to Matt Walsh, and Joe Rogan was arguing for homosexual marriage and pushing Matt Walsh on this. And all of the comments on there are like, wow, the rare Joe Rogan W. And like, well, I don't like him, but I mean, he's right here. And like, wow, I'm kind of surprised. And it's like, anyone
if you listen to Joe,
listened to Joe Rogan would know that. Exactly. It's like, he's actually a pretty progressive guy. Like, he's not this right-wing extremist, but
he said he would vote for Bernie Sanders.
Exactly. Yeah. All these morons dogpile onto him. And so this person, I'm sure, would call Joe Rogan a right-wing extremist, and in the same vein, and say, oh, I don't need to understand him. And it's like, well, obviously you're missing the picture if you're not listening to him, because you're totally misinterpreting who he is and what he's about. So yeah, this is a terrible take in all. The only part of this take that I like is worshiping a failed president who sold out our country. Even that's a little cringy, because selling out our country, well, like every president's done that for the last, I don't know, 2 millennia.
Yeah.
If it had existed that long. Okay.
Speaking of that long,
Speaking of that long, we're moving on to this next take, which is anarchy had 1,000 years to prove itself. It was called the Dark Ages. Britt,
bad
enlighten us.
take, bad take. And I like. Here's the thing, though. I like this take. I like that we have this take because I think that this is actually, we're in the minority in terms of how many people disagree with this. Because I think when people hear anarchy, they do think of the Dark Ages or the medieval ages. They think of people with power implementing that power on people that don't have power, forcing them to do things that they don't want to do and giving them no other option. Just because we have the power and can say that this needs to happen, that's what's going to happen.
It sounds like you're describing government right now.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I think the only holdover that's bad from the Dark Ages is that, which is known as government today. Yeah. So I guess still, you'll probably do a better job of this than me, but in terms of laying out what anarchy is and libertarianism in itself, I boil it down to the non-aggression principle, right? Like the baseline moral for how we interact with each other is do not aggress upon another person, whether it's through theft or fraud or violence or any of those sorts of things. Outside of that, as long as the thing that defines what you can and cannot do is property lines and property ownership. And so, yeah, like the things that are bad in the Dark Ages, are the things that are true of the government today. I know you're probably a subscriber to the Tom Woods newsletter, as am I. And one of the ones I appreciated this last week that he came out with is, a lot of people say, well, if you don't like government, why don't you go move to Somalia? Because Somalia has no government or whatever. And yeah, Somalia is a pretty bad place. And I would way rather live in the United States than live in Somalia. But if you lived in countries like Somalia, of the countries that have government versus Somalia, which doesn't have a government, you would definitely pick to live in Somalia because Somalia has outdone all of the other countries around that do have governments when compared. And so you have to ask yourself the question, when you look at the United States and you look at all the good things and the amazing things that occur here, they're all done and born of free exchange, of free interaction, of people working together voluntarily, respecting each other's property rights, respecting each other's intellectual property, and putting in the right safeguards for those type of things, and moving forward and creating awesome stuff and creating more stuff for a lot. And the most prosperity that's ever been seen in human history has arisen because of that, in spite of the fact that we've had a government the past 250 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because people like to compare apples to oranges when it comes to examples like move to Somalia or whatever. But the better example that you have to look at is the contemporary nations. And even if the U.S. isn't perfect in the sense of like free market compared to other countries, the freer your markets, the general level of economic prosperity increases, right? So. And even China, where it is not a free market, they even had to liberalize some of their market control because they were doing so poorly not that long ago. So they had, it's not a total move into the free market. Obviously, it's a far cry from anything resembling liberty. But even that pull towards liberty in the sense of their markets being liberated helped them out to some degree. Now, it's been a long time since I've actually studied this in any depth, but from what I remember too is the Dark Ages weren't that bad. Like people love to jump on the Dark Ages as this awful time in history, but there was a lot that was lost to it because of like the burning of the libraries and stuff and the lost records of things. But from what I recall, like the civilization that happened there wasn't even that terrible. So I don't even think this take is anything insightful. If this was a historian making an argument specifically about the Dark Ages, that would be one thing, but I don't think this person's even bringing a unique perspective. I think they're just kind of regurgitating the boilerplate history topic they get fed, which is a shame because I'd like to actually hear back and forth on the merits or demerits of the Dark Ages and anarchical systems. But yeah, going back just to the basics, it's like, people talk about, well, anarchy, you're going to have people doing whatever they want, and you're going to have power structures and dynamics arise, and it's going to be unfair, and it's going to be, like gang violence everywhere. And it's like, wow, the way that I see it is the dystopia is now, in the words of Larry Sharp. We have people doing whatever we want. Yeah, it's called the government. They do whatever they want. Look at Washington State. They want to collect an income tax. They're telling their IRS agents to get ready to collect this capital gains income tax that was ruled unconstitutional by their own government, and they're saying, nope, ignore that, just collect it anyway. So I don't see any limitations on people doing what they want. You have power dynamics. You couldn't operate your business from 2020 to 2021, and if you tried to privately, serve people and do what you wanted without complying with these arbitrary government demands, you were shut down, you were fined, you were harassed. So there is a gang. It's just called the government. So, the difference in anarchy is it's like you can have voluntary associations of people, and it requires strong individuals to enforce, for sure. But that's why we want people to be better people too, because we don't. I wouldn't say that a political solution is the answer to society's woes. I don't think that's what anyone's trying to claim with anarchy, but that's always the standard it's held up against. Much like, move to Somalia as compared to the United States, anarchy isn't compared to what's going on currently. Anarchy is compared to utopia. Oh, you want anarchy? Oh, so there's never going to be any crime in anarchy land, right? And you're like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that in an anarchical society, you at the very least have people who can, work on themselves, form a voluntary association with like-minded people, protect each other's property and their out, posts. And generally you will find a move towards cooperation, because that is an easier, more sustainable way of living than constant conflict, especially with external threats. That's the other objection that often gets thrown, is like, how would you defend yourself from, foreign nations? It's like that all the more leads to, agreements within voluntary associations, but also means that if I'm in a voluntary association with like-minded people where I live, and we agree to defend our neighbors over there from attacks, it also means they can't impose a vaccine mandate on me, because we're not, we might have an association agreement there, but they can't tell me how to live. Yeah. And that's, I think, the important thing, where right now we do have a bunch of agreements, but the problem is the agreements also entail they can dictate how you live and what you can and can't do. Yeah. And you have no recourse in it.
Yeah, I think that, as Michael Malice says, that any argument against anarchy or the worst case scenarios that people put up against anarchy are always a description of the status quo. And I like what you're saying about, like, well, what are we going to do about national defense or whatever? And it's like, well, that argument can also be made, like, at a global level. Like, let's just say there are aliens out there. It's like, oh, well, we all need to band together or whatever. It's like, well, like, that's not necessarily, like, just because there's potential of that doesn't mean that we think that we all acknowledge that nations should be sovereign, right? That nations have the ability to choose how they interact with people, how they trade. And yeah, there can be consequences, because other nations can choose to not to trade with them. But it's like, why is it at that level it's accepted, but not all the way down to the individual level or the community level, which is where you and I believe that anarchy should be applied to. And the fact of the matter is, right, like, my whole point is that the entire globe, nations operate from a standpoint of anarchy, right? Individual actors choosing who they do not associate with. A lot of them have contracts with each other and all these different things. Why can't that be applied? I think the principle of that should be applied to all the way down to the individual and your property line.
I agree. Okay, we'll move to our next take here. This one reads, okay, so now we've all observed how the U.S. Constitution doesn't work to preserve liberty. What's the next big idea? Which is kind of going right along the lines of what we were saying in a sense. What are your thoughts, Britt?
Oh, it's a good take. Yeah, I saw another one. I thought about including it, but Kevin McCarthy put in. He tweeted out that, like, oh, first thing we're going to do, with the new Republican Congress in place, is we're going to read every single word of the U.S. Constitution from the floor. Something that hasn't been done in years. It's like, well, I just appreciate if you just implemented what it said. You don't even have to read it, man. Like, no, don't waste my time with that. Just implement what's being said. And that's the Constitution, right? Is a piece of paper that has great ideas on it, right? It's really great ideas, but is not something that can actually, either it is not designed to prevent how government has grown, or it is powerless to prevent it from growing to that point. And it all boils down to, right, individuals. Benjamin Franklin had that, you need to have a moral society, included in that is respect for liberty, to actually preserve liberty. If you don't have that, then you are going to lose. It doesn't matter what high and lofty, piece of paper you have hidden in your halls that you aspire to, if you don't live up to those principles, it's not going to work. And so I think from the new Libertarian Party's standpoint, spreading that idea, getting people into that actual philosophy to buy into the principle, I think is really important. And I that's part of why we do what we're doing here, is that we want to convince people, right, that there's a better way to live, that there's a better political philosophy to hold, and it does not have to include violence or forcing violence upon other people.
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head, because ultimately, I think conservatives are very good at recognizing that it is up to individual responsibility to take care of your communities, to take care of your neighbors, to help out the poor. That's a really great thing conservatives get right. The problem, and part of that is an understanding that if you just try to rely on a government program or a politician or whatever, the problem isn't going to get fixed. Unfortunately, I think conservatives have fallen into that exact same trap when it comes to the Constitution, because they think, well, it doesn't, we don't have to worry about, enforcing the order on levels that we don't have the authority to. We have to cede that to politicians, and we'll make sure that they're in check by the U.S. Constitution, not by actually reducing the power of government and like making sure that you're not just voting for a letter or someone who campaigns on something. I mean, it's what is the, I don't remember the exact odds, so these stats are not exact, but it's something like Congress gets like a 20 or 30% approval rating and like an 88 job retention percent or something like that. So it's always someone else, it's like, well, we can't afford to not vote for our person here, and because it's on my team or whatever. And so there's this really bad seeding of like, oh, we have to take care of our neighborhoods and our we can't let a government program fix our problems, but somehow the U.S. Constitution, which is a government artifact, will fix the government problem, rather than actually either going into office yourself and cutting, or voting for people who will. So I think that that's kind of one of the big problems I have with the Constitution is it's only as good as the people who enforce it, and it's a fine moral document in a sense, but it doesn't mean, one, it has the authority to rule over people's lives just because it was written. But two, even if you granted that it was the most ethical document to live by, and let's just assume that for the time being, even if you assume that, it doesn't matter. It can be ignored. It can be misinterpreted. It can be twisted. I mean, it's been ignored since the founding with John Adams and silencing dissenters of the government. It's been misinterpreted since the Commerce Clause has been twisted into longer than a fruit by the foot string. Like the ways that the government has manipulated the U.S. Constitution probably outnumber the ways it has lived by its actual prescribed meaning. And that's true on the U.S. Constitution level as it is on the local level. I'll bring up the example of the capital gains income tax that's in Washington State, where the U.S. Constitution, or excuse me, the Washington State Constitution says can't have a non-uniform tax on people's property greater than 1%. That's the ruling, and so that bans an income tax because the courts have ruled that your income is your property time and time again. And still, they passed a law that is a capital gains income tax. And they said, no, it's an excise tax. I won't get into all the specifics, but calling a capital gains tax an excise tax, not an income tax, it's just like saying, no, my VW Beetle is a bicycle, not a car. It just doesn't make sense. And so they're just ignoring it. And so then a court ruled on it, and the court said, nope, this is unconstitutional. And they're still trying to collect the tax while it's going to the state Supreme Court. So it doesn't matter. Conservatives love to rely on the U.S. Constitution. They love to think the legal system will take care of it because people there are factual and rubber meets the road. But that's not how the world works. The world is full of people who want power, and that's where they gravitate, is to politics. And now you have ideologues running universities. Not now, I will say pretty much always you've had ideologues running the universities. And so these people are getting into the institutions, and they will simply ignore that piece of paper that is the Constitution.
Yeah, and I always had a hard time with the Constitution. I grew up pretty conservative, and then in my college years, hanging around you and everything, became obviously more libertarian. But even when I was conservative, I had a hard time because, like, well, I think the Constitution is important. Like, I know it's important, but it is just a piece of paper, and I don't understand the power that it holds. Like, that seems kind of like archaic to think we have to live towards this piece of paper. And I guess at the end of the day, right? Like, what I was, my conservative brain was figuring out that cognitive dissonance between, like, oh, like, yeah, I can't force someone to live by a piece of paper. Like, that piece of paper, I have to actually explain and convince people why what that piece of paper is saying is the right thing. And I still think that, what is in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all these things are really important, are really good principles to live by, really good principles to build a community around, and to personally live by. But at the same time, I don't believe that I have the moral authority to go force that upon my neighbor to live by. Right? I can make sure that they don't enforce, make it so that I can't live by that, or that other people that don't want to live, or that will also want to live by it, can't live by it. But yeah, and I think that's where it gets kind of tricky for conservatives, right? Because it's like they don't understand. It's like, oh yeah, like if I want to truly uphold the principles of this document, those principles actually have to transcend the document itself. They don't end at the document.
Yeah, I think that is another, and with conservatives who tend to be theistic or religious or whatever, they, I think, would rightly agree with our point. The government can't make you a better person, but I think that also applies to the Constitution, right? The Constitution can't make you a better person. You can choose to try to live by those ideals, and it's a good idea, but only something that is supernatural will actually change your heart, which I believe is the Bible and God's work and Jesus Christ and stuff, but not the Constitution. But the Constitution is a good political framework if we followed it. Problem is, you need that change of heart to follow something in an ethical way, without trying to usurp power and cheat to get ahead.
Absolutely.
Okay, this take comes from Jack. I'm not even sure that last name is that Cocchiarella.
Yeah, he's like one of those Biden influencer types.
Got it. Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar. I apologize for butchering your name, Jack. He tweets, "It doesn't say AR-15 in the Constitution. Ban assault weapons now." Speaking of the Constitution,
I know. There you go. There you go. It's kind of nice. I didn't plan for that to happen the way it did, but it did.
What a segue.
Doesn't matter. Let's talk about the principle in the Constitution. Bad take on my end. First off, it looks like you agree with me. Yeah, it doesn't say AR-15 in the Constitution, but what is the principle that it's trying to uphold? That the people have a right to defend themselves and their property from foreign or domestic actors that mean them harm. It didn't say aircraft carriers, could be built by the government and sent over, other places or anything like that. There's a lot of stuff that the Constitution that they didn't have the ability to see what technological things were going to happen. So it's very principle oriented, right? So that's why when you get judges that are quote unquote constitutionalist, what they're trying to say is that judge wants to look at what principles are in the Constitution and apply them to today. And that's a good thing, I think, because it's better than the opposite, which some of the more liberal justices are. But you're trying to apply a principle of freedom and liberty towards rulings to today. Obviously, with the AR-15, that's the equivalent of the musket, right, of the 1700s. And they have these jokes about, well, it meant well regulated. It's like, well, you don't understand. You got to also understand the context of the day, which is well regulated meant like well trained, well armed, well outfitted. And so that would also extend to owning the weapons of the day that are, make you competent, which today would be an AR-15.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is obviously ban assault weapons now is stupid because assault weapons isn't a category, and we've been over that a million times. And I don't know why poor AR-15s always get the brunt end here. It's like AR-15s are actually used in the very minority of shootings.
People get hit by a hammer or blunt object, killed more by a blunt object than an AR-15 each year.
And even within shootings and mass shootings, I don't think AR-15 is a weapon of choice. That's just the easy, thing to regurgitate because I don't know. It's a buzzword, I guess. So,
well, it puts us on the even playing field with the government. It puts
Yeah. No, I just mean I don't know why people use that one specific gun when there have been plenty of other ones.
But I think it's like what I'm trying to say is like I think it's the I think it's like the cultural like manipulation of the government. Because
Oh,
like,
I see what you're
why is it the AR-15? Well, the AR-15 makes citizens, normal citizens, a threat to the government.
Right.
Like a handgun versus an AR-15 or any semi-automatic rifle is like doesn't stand a chance if you ever shot
Right.
one of these two things. And so there's a reason why, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're good for sure. That's and when that makes sense. It's just it's again, but it's a stupid arbitrary distinction because in any other context, you don't you know you don't take things like spelled out literally unless you're talking about the most insane legal contract that's liable to be sued over, and that's why you have these stupid government regulated like contracts that you have to like even in the housing industry, like when you buy a house and you have these pages of all these things specified because you want your contract agreed. It's like most normal people, most normal humans do not operate in the way where it's like, hey Britt, what, you're welcome to anything in my fridge. It's like, well, okay, he didn't say I was welcome to bread. It was not specifically said I can have the bread in there. And he put the bread in the fridge after he said you're welcome to anything in my fridge. And since he didn't say bread, I don't know if I can do that. Or vice versa, you're not gonna you're welcome to anything in my fridge. They would like to make the argument that it'd be like saying you're welcome to anything in my fridge, and if I had, like, I don't know, a vault of money in there, you're taking the vault of money. Obviously I didn't mean that, but of course that's why you have to interpret these things not in a purely word for word literal sense, and also not in such an overly broad, well, I know what they meant kind of meaning. You have to understand, like you said earlier, the principle of it. And the principle is you have the right to self-defense for your family and for your property. That's what you have. And whether that comes in the form of arming yourself with guns or whether that comes with arming yourself with swords or bayonets at the time, it doesn't matter. That is your right, and the government can't take that from you. That is the principle. So it doesn't need to say AR-15, because if an AR-15 helps me defend myself and my property, that's what I have the right to.
Yeah, the right to defend yourself. I think when you put it that way, it's so hard to argue against banning any sort of firearm. I'm not sure if I've told this story on the podcast before, but I was up kind of north of where we live here in Washington, pretty far out, about 40 minutes outside of cell range, up in the mountains, and my buddy and I were shooting. We were practicing. There's kind of a spot out there that a lot of people go and everything. So we were out there practicing and everything, and it got a little bit late. And my buddy wanted to try something out, and before we knew it, it was dark. And we're about 40 minutes out, and it's dark, so we're packing up. I've got a flashlight. I got a flashlight on my weapons as well. And we start hearing a growl, kind of in the distance. I'm like, oh man, here in Washington, there's things like cougars, there's bears, lots of nasty things that want to eat you potentially. And I remember, on the trek back to the car, I was like, well, you know what? If I'm going to be out here in the dark, in the middle of nowhere with potentially like a cougar or a bear on my back, like at least I have these things in my hands, these boat anchors, as I like to call them, that I lost in a boating accident. But at least I have my AR-15 with me, right? At least I have that with me, and I have a fighting chance, and that's like reassuring. And what I realized in that moment is that feeling of capability, that feeling of the ability to defend yourself against violence. Very little chance, that I'm going to get attacked by a cougar in the woods. Somewhat higher chance that I'm going to get attacked by someone in downtown Seattle. The feeling of self-defense that I had in that moment, they want to take away from you. They don't want you to feel that ability. They want you to be a sitting duck. And I that makes you realize like how wrong and awful and demented these people are. And then it compounds upon the fact that you realize they want to take away those things from you because they want to be able to enact their will upon you. The government doesn't want you to have an AR-15 because if you had an AR-15, it'd mean that you actually have somewhat of an equal footing with them. Yeah, Biden says, well, you need a nuke or you need an F-15. But it's like, dude, you couldn't win a war in Afghanistan against goat herders with AK-47s. So I'm pretty sure a bunch of Americans with AR-15s do pose a threat and do keep you in check, and that's why they don't want you to have them.
That's exactly right. I think we can move on to the last one. Sounds here. Good. All right. This one comes from Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's quote retweeting Vice President Kamala Harris. So Kamala starts by tweeting, "One shot once a year. That's all most people will need to stay protected from COVID year long. Make a plan to get your shot at vaccines.gov.
And what date was
And
this said? This wasn't 2020. She
no,
tweeted
this
that out
was,
today.
yes, that was today, November 28, 2022.
Yeah.
And Dr. Peterson quote retweets saying, "Is that all, Vice President? Shilling shamefully for the pharmaceutical companies. The Biden admin is a subsidiary of Pfizer and Moderna. Appalling fascist collusion." So we'll go over both, but for the all intents and purposes, we're evaluating Dr. Peterson's quote here. So thumbs up, thumbs down.
Oh, 2 thumbs up. Good job, Dr. Peterson. On Twitter, he's a bit of a loose cannon,
True.
so every now and then he says something that's a little bit weird, but he's still got a really good bedrock principle. I'm a big fan of him, and I'm a big fan of his take on this. He nails it. The Biden administration, the Trump administration, both administrations might as well be subsidiaries of Pfizer and Moderna. You can include Dr. Fauci because he spanned both of those administrations. What people don't realize that from the span, I think it was 2009 to 2018, something like that, over a period of 10 years, over $300 million in vaccine royalties and rewards were paid to people that approved vaccines or evaluated vaccines and approved them at the FDA. So literally, the people that are in charge of approving drugs were also getting put on the list and got over $300 million paid out to them. And so there's a lot of, you could say, conflict of interest in terms of what drugs should or should not be approved. And when you find out, I think 30% of FDA drugs get recalled after a year or something like that, then you realize it kind of compounds a little bit further about how much collusion and how much these guys actually are operating as a subsidiary of these companies.
Collusion. I thought the only collusion was Russian collusion.
Yeah,
that was the only thing we needed to worry about. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic take. I was laughing because, Kamala's tweeting one shot once a year. That's all most people need to stay protected year long. I'm like, why should anyone at this point believe a word you say? Even if you are blue pilled and you think that, let's say you think the vaccines are good, you think that the people in power, when they were wrong, it was out of just a miscalculation or a lack of understanding, not malicious. Assume you are there, right? Assume you are, well, they meant well. How can you still take anything they say at face value? Because even if they aren't malicious, which I think it's very, very difficult to say that they are not malicious, but even if they aren't malicious, they are so incredibly wrong, and their track record is so incredibly appalling, from the basics of don't wear a mask, actually wear a mask, actually you have to wear an N95, and by that time, they're back in stock, and also it's a what did they call it? A pandemic of the unvaccinated. Oh wait, nope, crap. Being vaccinated doesn't protect it from spreading. It just protects you from ever getting it. Well, it doesn't protect you from getting it, but it does help you reduce the symptoms. There is no coherent anything that the official narratives have been able to put out that's lasted longer than a month or 2 months. Man, how come you're not, double masking outside, Kamala? Like, I was pretty sure that was a pretty strong recommendations from your team not that long ago. So, even if somehow you are so head in the sand about this that you think that they're not malicious and there's no perverse incentives, as Dr. Peterson, points out, it would be crazy to still take their word on anything and taking their advice and thinking that that it would be realistic. I mean, let me tell you, if I went to the doctor and I have like a nasty rash on my arm, and that doctor says, "Here, take this medicine," and I took the medicine and it didn't go away, and they said, "Oh, sorry, nope, not that medicine. Here's a different one." Took that medicine, didn't go away. Okay, we're gonna perform this surgery. We perform the surgery and it doesn't go away. I'm not going to that doctor again, even if I don't think he's a crook and a hack, even if I think he's just been wrong. I'm going to find someone else's advice to trust, not this doctor anymore.
Yeah. I think it really hits home when you look at Kamala's debates with Mike Pence. when I can't remember which one it was. She may have only debated once.
I think there was one, yeah.
Only one. And I remember the moderator said, "Hey, when Operation Warp Speed produces this vaccine, will you take it?" And she said something to the tune of, if it's the vaccine developed by Trump, no, I wouldn't take it. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I remember hearing that at the time. I didn't have an opinion one way or the other about the vaccine because it hadn't been released yet, but I remember hearing that and being like, dude, that's like so political. Like it's so transparently like there is this option that could potentially alleviate, if we buy into your framework of why we need to shut down the country and all these things, if we buy into that, you have an option to fix that. And you won't take it because you want the people to suffer long enough so they get uncomfortable enough to put you into power. And so then you see her do a complete 180, obviously, 6 months later, when she can now use vaccine compliance. The Biden administration can use vaccine compliance as a club to beat their political opponents and you and I and other people into submission. It becomes even more evil and awful.
The people who were cheering for her saying, yes, queen, when she said that, are the ones mocking anyone skeptical of it because of the collusion between the government and pharmaceutical companies. They're the ones who are mocking people for not taking the vaccine because they've seen the myocarditis, you know what I'm saying, heart disease data, excuse me, that's come out from that. The people who mindlessly cheer the people in power who are blatantly political, blatantly transparent, and flip-flop, they're now mocking people who don't want to take it because just the other day they were like, no, we're definitely not going to take it because it was produced by a white fascist hate speech spewing failed president, Z-Snap. It's like, give me a break. You people are ridiculous. And so that's one thing that I really appreciate about Peterson's verbiage here specifically is that he does call it appalling fascist collusion, right? He nails the term there of the fascism, right? Where the government has private industries take on essentially as arms of the government without being officially owned by the government. And so I think his language is not only accurate but precise, which I think is
that's very Jordan Peterson.
Beneficial. Yeah, exactly.
I don't have any more on it.
All right. Well, then we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure to leave a like, a share, a comment, all that good stuff. We appreciate engaging with you in the comments and stuff like that. So we will catch you guys on the next one. Take care.
Yeah.